Mulholland Drive is typically considered to be the greatest film by the extraordinary filmmaker David Lynch. Its elusive narrative structure, surrealist symbolism and cunning self-reflexivity have won the film fans among cinephiles and general audiences alike. For a film released in 2001, it is notable that many consider Mulholland Drive as a contender for one of the very best films of the 21st century. The internet is awash with attempts to explain the film's narrative complexities and disentangle its Gordian knot to establish what it all means. Here I do not intend to outline an imagined solution to its mysteries. Instead, I wish to consider how it has had such an important impact in provoking a conscious and unconscious response in audiences. I also propose that Mulholland Drive works as a triangulation between two films that are notable influences: Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali's Un Chien, Andalou and Victor Fleming's The Wizard of Oz. One is a notoriously disturbing experimental classic adored by film academics. The other is a generally beloved film whose popularity gives it cultural real estate, in the words of Alexander O. Philippe's excellent documentary Lynch Oz. David Lynch approached filmmaking from the perspective of an art student, initially making short pieces that were full-blooded experiments with cinematic form, culminating in his long gestating first masterwork Eraserhead, that established most of the director's key points of style and motifs, including meticulously crafted ambient soundscapes and a bizarre juxtaposition of American Midwestern manners barely masking a terrifying, grotesque undercurrent. The film also exhibits a terror of adult responsibilities, in this case fatherhood, that stretches out across all of Lynch's work. In his long interview of his formative years released as The Art Life, Lynch recalls two stories of early childhood. One is about a naked woman who appears in his street, terrifying the children with odd behaviour. He doesn't explain what that is or why it is so terrifying. The other is an aborted recollection involving a neighbour's parent, Mr. Smith, that Lynch declines to finish. These recollections are informative. First, that his expression of the child's perspective that the adult world is mysterious, with an undercurrent of repressed sexual and possibly violent behaviours unleashed, is important, but left unexplained. Second, the telling of each is framed like scenes straight out of Mulholland Drive, unfinished or unexplained, but also memorable, strangely revealing and psychologically disturbing. It is almost as if Lynch is giving us a peek behind the curtains being a liminal motif in his films, a dramatic point of entry between realities that also refers to the performed, mask-like aspect of public behaviours, and an unmistakable nod to The Wizard of Oz, which we will get to. In Mulholland Drive, the Club Sencio sequence is pointedly theatrical and based around illusion and the revelation of that illusion. The sequence operates outside of the rest of the film, which is mostly based around the movies, not the stage. The lighting in the club stresses unreality, and Betty and Rita are positioned in the audience, situating them in the same point of spectatorship as us. The announcer operates as director, setting the scene and, crucially, noting the unreality in advance. What is to follow is not real. This forewarning is almost Brechtian, but the performance that follows is so affecting that we will still be sucked in. Rebecca Del Rio's performance of Roy Orbison's crying is beautiful and heartfelt. The song lyrics deal with solitude, rejection and guilt. Despite, or because of, the language shift in the lyrics sung in Spanish, they are powerfully rendered until suddenly revealed as fake. Lip-syncing to a song is a Lynch motif found elsewhere, notably Blue Velvet. We can't help but note the aspect of performativity, the space between being moved by a powerful rendition and the technique that drives it, an experience that Roland Barthes calls jouissance. When Del Rio drops to the floor while the voice continues, it is a shocking disruption to the illusion that we had been pre-warned not to fall for. Performance in general in Lynch films is often arch, stylised, hyper-real. It draws attention to itself. Mulholland Drive's most emotionally intimate scenes include this and Betty's audition, another sequence that is flagged in advance as unreal, yet the single-take camera proximity and intensity in the performance suck us in until the on-screen audience applaud. As the Club Silencio performance unfolds, Betty, who is of course the audience herself, begins to shake violently, as if becoming aware that the break with unreality will wake her from the illusion that the film has spun around her. Narratively, the Club Silencio sequence occurs at the high point of the Betty-Rita fantasy, having consummated a sexual relationship and the two now appearing to be the same person, another illusion. The mise-en-scène, including Rita's wig, the playhouse setting and dry ice, all point to the performative nature of illusion in the theatrical, cinematic, and unconscious perception of the world. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's concept of the divided self is useful here. Lacan focused on language and symbols as key determinants of subjectivity, one's perspective on the world. He suggested that the ego is split between conscious and unconscious aspects, and our perception of self ultimately results in the impossibility of complete satisfaction, because it's only a perception. For Lacan, mirrors symbolise self-reflection and the search for identity, representing the fractured self and the unconscious. Applying this to the study of film generally, we see how most narratives concern a character's quest for fulfillment, ultimately achieved because this is the shared desire of spectators. Essentially, Lacanian film theory explores how the unconscious influences our reception of film events, and how cinema triggers a pleasurable experience akin to dreaming and wish fulfillment. The films of David Lynch are different. They abound with symbols of unconscious Lacanian wish fulfillment, but offer at best only ambiguous realization, or in Mulholland Drive only elliptical, inconclusive points of resolution and unanswered questions. Lynch leaves us with a film that at times seems very mainstream, accessible and near complete, but not quite. Mulholland Drive is concerned with the Lacanian quest for the imagined self and its symbols. What is behind the Winkies? What is the blue box? Who is the cowboy? Illusory fulfillment is for other filmmakers. Trying to solve the puzzle of Mulholland Drive is like Betty's dream. It isn't the point. After the acclaim that Eraserhead achieved, it is not unfair or intended as criticism to suggest that from that point on, Lynch's work in films could be seen as experiments in the mainstream. His next film, The Elephant Man, manages to be both narratively clear and emotionally accessible, while maintaining the qualities that are now considered Lynchian, including the collision of bourgeois self-perception and gentility as a thin veil over sensitivities concerning monstrousness. Lynch's biggest foray into the mainstream was Dune, which, due to his loss of control over the final edit, resulted in a film that was, for once, unintentionally incoherent. After this, Lynch released films that gained audiences, won awards, and generally made a profit. He made TV adverts and released albums. He was a genial interviewee. Later in life, he began a series of weather forecasts. By the time of Mulholland Drive, Lynch had firmly established a method that melded two distinct strands of filmmaking. One that was at heart the experimentation and nightmarish journeys into the id of Eraserhead. The other was, if not quite mainstream, then mainstream adjacent. Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali's Un Chien Andalou and Victor Fleming's The Wizard of Oz are the twin points of reference here. While other influences are notable in Lynch's work, it is via the filmmaking strategies of the first of these and the thematic qualities and iconography of the second that can be seen as vital, recurring elements across his filmography, and in Mulholland Drive in particular. Un Chien Andalou established an approach to filmmaking at the cusp of silent and sound film that directors at the experimental end of cinema have adopted ever since. It is an avowedly surreal film. Surrealism attempts to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind, for example through the irrational juxtaposition of images, unlike, say, the Soviet montage filmmakers who aim to establish an entirely different approach to formalism, or some experimental film artists who adopted techniques that challenge the very concept of what film is. Buñuel and Dali used an approach that continuously disrupts the logic that the classic Hollywood methodology of continuity editing attempts to establish, resulting in a tension between form and artificial structure. Look at a Dali painting for comparison. The style of draftsmanship is classical, the matter is not. This approach utilises the devices of shot-reverse-shot, eyeline matches, cut-on action and so forth that were already long familiar to audiences by the late 1920s. The film offers a continual promise that a pattern will start to emerge and that its narrative enigmas will resolve. They don't. Instead, we get a series of disconnected and seemingly unrelated events, a sequence of conventional dissolves to wider shots seeming to signal an ending that doesn't come, performances stylised into gestures, The final shot is inexplicably disconnected to the whole. There's no clear cause and effect relationship between scenes, which challenges traditional storytelling. These irrational, fragmented sequences mirror the nature of dreams, where meaning can be elusive and ambiguous. The film drifts rather than progresses. Dream logic evokes emotional and psychological responses rather than intellectual ones. This ambiguity asks us to confront its symbols subjectively and make our own interpretations, rather than adhering to a single fixed meaning. Surrealist images disrupt the viewer's expectations and evoke subconscious associations, rather than rational interpretations. Juxtapositions seem suggestive purely because they have been put together, so there must be some connection. It's probably rude, but it dares us to think it for ourselves and feel the shame. Ants crawl out of a hole in a man's hand. We cut from a cloud crossing the moon to the slicing of an eye, or the dissolve from pubic hair to the sea urchin. A severed hand and a street accident arouse the libido. Any of these could find a home in a David Lynch film. The film also establishes a diegetic space, which it then disrupts. The door opens variously out onto stairs, the same room again, and a beach. The time frame becomes meaningless, with intertitles proving to be wholly unreliable. These elements in a film are artificially created aspects of the diegesis, and Chien, Andalou purposefully deconstructs this. Mulholland Drive has its own disruptions to narrative and temporal logic. In what order do the Winky scenes take place, if any of them take place at all? What is disgusting about the coffee? Why is Adam being forced to select a particular girl? Chien Andalou's repetitive tango in the score, or the romantic theme from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, are both incongruous to their respective scenes, so the use of sound enhances the surreal atmosphere and draws attention to the visual composition and symbolism rather than enhance a mood or attempt narrative communication. Lynch's score to Mulholland Drive involves bubblegum pop or jitterbug music, up against eerie silences and brooding drones. Just as in expressionist cinema, the use of the doppelganger presents characters as fragmentary, contradictory, and unfixed in identity, with motives vaguely related to urges from the id. Mulholland Drive's framing narrative, if we can call it that, is driven by the base desires and guilt of Diane, who disconnects herself from her self-image. The film often defies social norms and moral expectations, using shocking and uncomfortable imagery to challenge bourgeois conventions. Sexual taboos, mutilation and death are obvious drivers that connect Un Chien Andalou and Mulholland Drive. On the other hand, there's Lynch's acknowledged love of The Wizard of Oz. Alexander O'Phillippe's documentary Lynch Oz explores in detail the huge impact that Victor Fleming's film had on Lynch, noting among a number of connections the recurring motif of transportation from one perception of reality to another, the name-dropping of Dorothy or Judy Garland in different Lynch texts, and particularly the numerous overt references to the film in Wild at Heart, including red shoes and the appearance of Galinda. Elsewhere, yellow lines on the highway and something going on behind theatrical curtains abound. I would also add that the Wicked Witch's sudden, unexplained demise caused by a bucket of water is echoed in the sudden, relatively mundane ways that Lynch typically dispatches his villains when it is time for them to go. Drawing on a few key points made in the Philippe film will suffice here. One, that Oz is a film considered as populist surrealist, strange if you think about it, yet accessible to all audiences, and that its long popularity gives it cultural real estate that Lynch is able to draw on without explaining, knowing that his audiences will share in recollections of the folk memory of Oz. Lynch can refer to the film stylistically, structurally and thematically. Lynch taps into the film through both direct intertextual references and subtle stylistic nods across his work. With this in mind, I suggest that Mulholland Drive, while not Lynch's most overtly Oz-referencing film, that is definitely Wild at Heart, we can see how it draws on a multi-layered intertextuality through themes, motifs and characteristics that goes beyond mere Easter eggs. The main events of both films begin with a female experiencing a head trauma. She then must find her way home with the aid of friends she meets along the way. Lynch uses doubling of characters from one perceived reality into the other, just as in the Fleming film. The difference here is that it is not just the secondary characters who are doubled, but the guileless heroine herself, multiple times, as Diane, Betty and Rita all blur, while her broader characteristics and fears are spread out among other characters. For instance, Adam seems to be a projection of Diane's fear of romantic betrayal and loss of control of her life and movie within the main narrative. The sound of wind over the blue box could also allude to the tornado that whisks our protagonist from one reality to another in The Wizard of Oz. That might be fanciful, but Lynch was meticulous in his sound design, and wind, or a wind-like instrumental sound, is a common motif across his films. Lynch also employs a hyperreal colour palette reminiscent of late 1930s Technicolor. Look at the greens outside of the Winkies restaurant that are reminiscent of the Emerald City. Oz is essentially a nightmare lurking behind a sheen of wholesomeness, a description that fits most Lynch films. The contrast between idyllic fantasy and the grotesque, terrifying adult world is both comic and horrifying. A benign Galinda figure offering abstruse advice here becomes the ridiculous yet intimidating cowboy. The announcer at the Club Silencio is of course a wizard figure, promising a revelation. Lynch also utilises long-duration use of double exposure, a device used in Fleming's film that would seem quaint and old-fashioned to most modern filmmakers. Here it seems to suggest vague, liminal connections. Another point made in Philippe's documentary is that the cultural capital of The Wizard of Oz is intrinsically linked to the 1950s, despite being released in the 30s. Its success really only cemented through repeated annual broadcasts on 1950s American television, a period when Lynch was young, possibly having bizarre encounters with his adult neighbours. At the high point of its viewership, it was already a thing of wholesome nostalgia for a nation that would go on to see the 1950s as a high point of national greatness, ignoring the inequality and oppression bubbling underneath. Just like the polished sheen of a dino with a vague, unsettling sense of something unpleasant lurking round the back. Inevitably, the 1950s aesthetic runs throughout Lynch's work. What time period is Mulholland Drive set in anyway? Philippe also proposes that Lynch taps into the commonly known folklore around the Oz film, particularly Judy Garland's troubled real life that undermines the clean-cut image of Dorothy that she was forever associated with. Garland Dorothy becomes Diane Betty. Finally, back to the Club Silencio sequence, Lynch Oz proposes that the lip-syncing of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, while is Garland's own voice but synced in performance in the film, fascinated Lynch to the point of obsessing over this odd aesthetic of the movie musical genre. Audiences usually know that it is both true and not true and don't typically worry about it. Not here. Lynch pulls back the curtain on the artifice and then promptly sails off in a balloon. We are left behind though, stuck in Oz to find our own way home. This wizard takes the red shoes with him. Mulholland Drive, both experimental and yet something like accessible, both comparable to a notoriously disturbing surrealist provocation and a wholesome family musical, both a journey of self-discovery and resistant to a resolution. It packs a lot into its blue box.
I'm going to play Somewhere Over the Rainbow and try to anyway.